Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 595, 3 Commando Bridge, The Fallen. Last time, Patton's forces had reached and taken Palermo. It was congratulations all around. That is, except for General Omar Bradley of the 2nd Corps, who was driving due north, taking on the German forces as they tried to retreat east to reach the Mount Etna line. Still, it was a time of rejoicing for the Americans after the snub from Monty and, to a degree, from C&C Alexander. To be sure, elements of the 2nd Corps, which had started deep in the south, had to overcome blown bridges and counterattacks while still managing to cooperate with the British. On July 14th, the U.S. 157th Regiment was held up, but this allowed a nearby British force on their right to charge ahead and take the town of Vincini. Meanwhile, the 180th Regiment took the Biscari airfield, but only after hand-to-hand fighting, and then fighting, though tired, to deflect a counterattack. On July 15th, the Americans stood up to another counterattack, this one supported by Mark IV tanks. The GIs fixed their bayonets and took the brunt of the enemy charge at 5:50 a.m. As for the Panzers, one was taken out by a rifle grenade, another when a 4.2-inch phosphorus mortar shell went right through the opened hatch. The crew inside was killed. This was enough for the Germans to call a halt to their attack. On July 18th, General Guzzoni, the nominal head of the Axis forces on the island, chose that day to pull out of western Sicily, leaving a regiment of the Aosta Division in Palermo, which is what the 7th Infantry Motorized Patrols had to contend with as they entered the port city. The Italians were to have supervised the removal of supplies, which of course never happened. Also, 15,000 tons of more supplies were about to be abandoned, but the Americans said, "Thank you very much," to this as well. For the headquarters of the U.S. Provisional Corps, the 2nd U.S. Armored Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, they, now in Palermo, became an occupation force of western Sicily and commenced with their well-earned rest. As for Bradley's 2nd Corps, despite engaging the rear parties of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, Bradley's men basically bisected Sicily in 5 days. Rome might not have been able to effectively fight back with troops, but they had their words. When the Allies first landed on Sicily, Rome spoke of the nation over the radio of rallying to the cause, as the enemy was now on Italian soil. Of course, those words were of little comfort, as one Sicilian town after another fell. The only man not surprised at the news was Hitler. On July 11th, so 24 hours after the Allies came ashore in strength on Sicily, the German leader decided to reinforce the island, as the Allies could use it to attack the Balkans, or have bombers take off from there and reach industrial cities in Italy and Germany. Thus, he ordered Kesselring to transfer the 1st Parachute Division from France, the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, as we saw, and the 14th Panzer Corps headquarters was to make for Sicily, to take command of the German units on the island. What Kesselring found on Sicily did not fill him with confidence. Kesselring, standing on Sicilian soil by July 12th, found Guzzoni and von Segner, the German liaison officer to the Italian 6th Army, uninspiring. They admitted that they could not push the enemy back into the sea, so had to fight defensively, but wasn't excited by reinforcements either, certainly not enough to counterattack, as they did not have the transports or supplies for them. And that would just be more men and equipment to carry off the island once Sicily was abandoned. No, Kesselring was not inspired, but he was realistic. The best course now, given what had happened so far, was to reduce the amount of territory being defended, thus maximizing Axis firepower, meaning putting a corridor around their future escape route at Messina. And to do this, time was needed. Step 1, stop the Allies from taking Catania, and the Schmaltz Group was working on that currently. But even with the Napoli Division helping Schmaltz, things were not going well. So Guzzoni ordered the Hermann Goering Division to move east and assist. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division would also help, but they were further west, so would take longer to get there. Before July 12th was over, the Commando Supremo in Rome had pretty much given up on the idea of pushing the enemy back into the sea. Thus, the next best thing, a tried and true method, was to attack their shipping lanes, thus depriving the enemy forces on Sicily of future supplies, which of course required aircraft. That the Italians did not have in reserve, so a call to Hitler would have to be made. Meanwhile, Kesselring was on the phone with Colonel General Jodl of the OKW, the Armed Forces High Command, as he, Kesselring, wanted to drag out the fighting on Sicily for as long as possible to boost the morale of the Italians. He wanted it all: men, planes, submarines, and E-boats. Jodl, for himself, wanted to give up on Sicily, but this was a call only that Hitler could make. To wit, Der Führer said, give Kesselring what he needed, and what he needed was the rest of the 1st Parachute Division. The 29th Panzer Grenadier Division was to move to Calabria to be ready to cross into Sicily. General Hube's 14th Panzer Corps headquarters was to make for the island, and Luftflotte II in Sardinia and southern Italy was to be reinforced. Hitler was basically making it known to all, certainly those in Rome, that the enemy was to be delayed for as long as possible, with a defensive line around Mount Etna from San Stefano to Catania. And yet, Hitler wanted General Hube to exclude Guzzoni and the other Italian generals from Germany's plans, and that all Axis forces, even the Italians, were now under the command of Hube. And Hube's ultimate goal, as set by Hitler, was to save as many German lives as he could. And this is when events picked up the pace. On July 15th, the 14th Panzer Corps headquarters arrived in Sicily and took command of all German forces, namely the 2 German divisions. But as German reinforcements had arrived so quickly, they lacked transport, so Hube ordered them to take vehicles from the Italians. Most of these gave up the equipment when asked, others not so much, and thus shooting broke out, with casualties on both sides. While the Axis partners were killing each other, the Commando Supremo, General Vittorio Ambrosio, explained to Mussolini in great detail it was now not possible for the Axis to win this war. No, Mussolini needed to pull Italy out of the fight and make a separate peace. At the same time, July 14th, Berlin updated its plans to hold on to Italy should Il Duce governments fall or try to get out of the war separately. Meanwhile, Monty was stuck. Monty's plan, as covered, was to drive north and take the Primosole Bridge across the Cimento River, just south of Catania, in Operation Fustian. Brigadier General Lathbury's 1st Parachute Brigade, the Red Devils, from the British 1st Airborne Division, would land men to each side of the river and secure the bridge on July 14th. Also, the Malate Bridge along the road from Lentini, further south of the Primosole Bridge, was to be taken by No. 3 Commando in an amphibious landing. This crossing over the Leonardo River was to fall by July 14th as well, thus not allowing the enemy time to reinforce either Axis units guarding these crossings. But should the enemy decide to counterattack to then destroy the bridges, 50th Division would be rushing up from Lentini to help. But right away, the Germans, with their plans, would upset the British plans, but more by chance than anything else. South of Lentini is the town of Kerlentini, and below it is Mount Pacali, and on it, Colonel Schmaltz had delaying positions set up as early as July 11th. These defensive measures would slow down the advance of the 50th Division, thus the first alteration to Monty's plan. The next day, July 12th, elements of the 1st Parachute Division was on its way to Sicily. Colonel Heilmann's 3rd Parachute Regiment, on board Junker 52 aircraft, were ready to drop when they were come across by 20 P-38 Lightnings, just as they were passing over the Straits of Messina. This could have been a German bloodbath. Fortunately for them, the American pilots were already low on fuel, thus they had to depart before engaging properly. The paratroops came down at 6:15 p.m. and were picked up by trucks. These elite soldiers were soon on their way to Lentini to support Schmaltz. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion of German paratroops went towards Francofonte, itself about 5 miles southwest of Lentini, with the rest of the regiment covering the area from Calentini to the coast. The next day, July 13th, the 1st Parachutes Machine Gun Battalion landed at Catania, and the battalion was to take up a spot about 1 mile south of the Primasol Bridge on the Cemento River on Highway 114. Again, because Hitler had said so, the Germans were moving very fast. And this machine gun battalion was set up in an orange grove, which was all but impossible to see from the air. And they had an excellent view of the road with their machine guns. During this, the leading units of the 50th Division were coming up the road, but meeting with stiffer resistance than planned for. The British units won out time and again, but only after fighting, which had come as a surprise. When the Italians were overrun at Solerio, south of Lentini, one of the 400 prisoners was the commander of the Napoli Division, General Gatti. Some of the Italian equipment survived this fight, but the 50th Division, still on the road, was most excited by the 15 surviving lorries, as they were under-equipped. Ignoring the French light tanks, the 69th Brigade jumped into these trucks and moved on. But when they reached a point about 3 miles shy of Carlentini, the British were brought up short again, as they were now facing machine gun fire from 2 different directions, and one of those was from Mount Bacali. Brigadier Cook Collins and General Kirkman, the 50th Divisional Commander, had to radio headquarters that Lentini would not be captured on this night. Still, Kirkman had the 69th continue to engage the enemy, but their artillery support had just shown up, so exactly where the enemy machine gun positions were was not known, which is when someone offered up the less than kind opinion that if there were Italians in those hills, then a few shells would probably dislodge them. If the 6th Battalion, the Green Howards, kept at it, and soon one of the enemy positions was overrun. 12 Germans were captured, not Italians. The enemy on Mount Bacale was still in place. While plans were made to deal with this, good news came that at least No. 3 Commando had landed with no issues to capture the Meliti Bridge over the Leonardo River further north. The British troops here at Mount Bacali rested for the night, and at 7 a.m., the 7th Battalion was to have moved out against Mount Bacali, but its supporting 124th Field Regiment could not be reached by radio. By the time this was rectified, the enemy came with their own attack in the form of several tanks. The tanks took out one British machine gun position, but before it could do any further damage, the recently silent artillery regiment found themselves and started firing. The tanks backed away, the way they had come, and the 7th Battalion used their retreat to launch their own attack. As the Germans did not have time to reset themselves mid-retreat, the Green Howards came in hard, and by 10 a.m., the height was cleared. Counting up, there were about 100 Germans on the height, but most of them were dead now, as they did not easily give up. There are 29 machine guns fired until those using them were shot themselves. To the east of all this, the 4th Armored Brigade, now under the 5th Division's command, was on the coastal road moving towards Lentini, where the coastal road and inner roads meet. But soon in front of the 4th Armored Brigade were 10 German panzers and several 88mm guns. The 4th Armored laid into them, but only after the Germans lost 1 tank and 2 guns did they back away. While the Germans here were being engaged, the 151st Brigade rested and readied to drive on. They were just waiting for Carlentini and Lentini proper to fall. And with the Germans being driven back and the machine gun positions on Mount Lacali falling, soon both of these towns were in Allied hands. Though one smaller bridge had already been blown by the Axis south of Carlentini, the larger bridges to the north, which the British needed to continue on, were intact. They were still operational, as the Germans would need them when they made good their escape, should it come to that. By 5 p.m., British manned Sherman tanks were on the move through Lentini, and as the sun set, the 4th Armored Brigade and infantry elements with them were just 1 mile south of Primasole Bridge. Fortunately for them, the No. 3 Commando had done their job at the Maliti Bridge before this, yet they paid a heavy price for their success. On July 13th, the Commandos boarded the Prince Albert to be taken to the Bay of Agnon, 20 miles northwest of Syracuse, which was still in enemy hands. Again, as the Maliti Bridge was 10 miles behind enemy lines and 5 miles inland, it was quite the challenge to take it before the enemy could detonate the explosives already attached to it. One of the reasons Monty considered this the most perilous enterprise of its No. 3 Commando's career. The first of 2 waves of commandos came under fire just as they set foot on the sand at 10 p.m., July 13th. But led by Lieutenant Colonels Durnford Slater, its commander, and Peter Young, along with Lieutenant George Herbert, the men kept moving, as they knew to stay still was to die. In time, the first wave got off the beach, but they did not neutralize the enemy firing on them. No, rather, they got past them and moved on. Thus, the second wave would be fired on as well, but speed was the order of the day. Traveling on, obviously their presence in general was known. Still, the Italians did not blow up the bridge. The commandos engaged with Italian patrols or were able to sneak by them. At 3 a.m., now July 14th, the first of the commandos were at the northeastern edge of the bridge. Not able to wait for too long, Durnford Slater let the men rest for a few minutes and then issued out his orders. No. 4 Troop would take the lead in rushing for the charges while the rest of them fired on the Germans. There were Italian soldiers, but these were to the south of the bridge, thus not an impediment, as the British were coming from the northeast. Still, there were Germans, or soon would be, to the west and immediate south of the bridge, and they had panzers. The commandos rushed in. The nearest pillboxes were cleared and the explosives removed. This took all of 10 minutes, but that was only the beginning of the battle. As more and more commandos arrived on the scene from the second wave, soon totaling 350 men, the Germans counterattacked with small arms, mortars, and again supported by panzers. With nothing to take out the panzers, the commandos started taking heavy casualties. But there was nothing for it. They had to hold until the 50th arrived. So the wounded and dead started increasing. The Germans would take control of the bridge again, with the commandos falling back. But this took time. The commandos fell back, going closer to the coast, and the Germans, forgetting their main priority, followed them. Hours later, after this cat-and-mouse game, the advanced units of the 50th Division came up the main road, the Italians unable to stop them, alone. The bridge was secured. Why wasn't it blown? That's a question for someone else. Now it was the Axis, i.e. the Germans chasing the commandos, who had to flee. Lieutenant John Shannon Erskine of No. 3 Commando, who was there, would write of this account. In part, he wrote, "Later, General Montgomery said, the battle for Malati Bridge was a classic battle, a model of how a commando operation ought to be conducted. He said we should put on the bridge a bronze plaque saying, 'No. 3 Commando Bridge,' which we did. We went in 350 strong. We lost 153, and 197 came back. Terrible losses. Some later battles were bad and some frightening, but not especially bloody. But this was the worst of the war for us, mainly because we were against helpless odds for so long. 10 days later, I went back with a party to identify and bury some of our dead. Some had already been recorded and buried in shallow graves by our own retreating troops, but they had all been dug up to steal the very high-quality boots we wore." End quote. The cruel realities of war are timeless. What you feel now, dear listener, Erskine felt then. Still, it was one bridge down, one to go.